He kissed me like it was the only way to save himself, and somehow, I was the one who couldn't breathe. That was the exact moment everything went wrong, or maybe right, depending on how you look at it, because 5 seconds earlier I was standing at the edge of a gala I had no business attending, wearing a suit that felt half a size too tight, and holding a press badge that practically screamed, "I don't belong here." And then Ethan Cole walked toward me like the entire room bent around him. Sharp suit, colder eyes. The kind of man people whispered about, but never approached, and before I could step back or even think, his hand landed on my waist, steady, deliberate, like he'd already decided something I hadn't, and he leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath brush my cheek as he murmured, "Play along." Like that was a normal thing to say before pressing his lips to mine in front of hundreds of people and a dozen flashing cameras. And I swear time didn't just slow down. It fractured. Because 1 second I was Noah Bennett, struggling freelance nobody, trying to keep his rent under $1,200 a month. And the next I was being kissed by one of the most untouchable CEOs in New York, like I belonged there, like I belonged to him. And when he pulled back, his hand didn't leave my waist. If anything, it tightened just slightly, grounding, claiming, and his voice cut clean through the noise of the room, calm, certain, "He's mine." And the words landed heavier than they should have, heavier than a joke, heavier than a lie. And suddenly everyone was looking at me differently, like I wasn't invisible anymore, like I was part of something dangerous, something real, and my heart was doing this ridiculous, traitorous thing where it wouldn't slow down, wouldn't listen, wouldn't stop reacting to the way his thumb brushed once, just once, against the fabric at my side, like he was testing how close he could stand without crossing a line neither of us had agreed to. And I wanted to shove him, demand answers, walk away before whatever this was swallowed me whole, but my body didn't move, didn't listen, because for the first time that night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was about to be pushed out of the room. And that terrified me more than the kiss, more than the cameras, more than the man standing way too close and acting like this was already decided, like I was already part of the story he was writing. And when I finally found my voice, low and shaky and definitely not as controlled as his, I whispered, "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't even blink, didn't even step back, just looked at me like I was the only thing in the room that mattered, and said, "Fixing a problem." And somehow that answer made everything worse, because I had a feeling I wasn't just part of the solution, I was about to become the problem. "You think you can just walk away after that?" I should have said yes, should have pushed past him and disappeared into the crowd before whatever this was could sink its claws into me. But instead I followed him, because of course I did, because curiosity has always been my worst habit, and Ethan Cole looked like a problem I was not equipped to solve. And 5 minutes later I was standing in a private hallway that smelled like polished wood and money, staring at him while my heart tried to figure out if it was panic or something worse. And he did not look rushed, did not look shaken, just adjusted his cuff like kissing a stranger in front of half of Manhattan was part of his daily routine. And I finally snapped, "You do not get to just grab me and turn my life into a headline." And his eyes flicked up to mine, calm, calculating, like he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever I was about to say next. "It was necessary," he replied. And that word should not have hit as hard as it did, because necessary for who? For what? For him. And suddenly I was very aware of how close he was standing again, how his presence filled the space without trying, how my body kept noticing things it had no right to notice, like the way his voice dropped just slightly when he was serious, like the way his gaze did not waver, not even for a second. "You could have picked anyone," I said, because that felt safer than asking why me, and for the first time, something shifted, subtle but real, his expression tightening just enough to make me think this was not as random as he wanted me to believe. "No," he said simply, and that was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just that single word that made my stomach twist in a way I did not appreciate, because it sounded like a decision, not an accident. And before I could press further, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket, notifications stacking on top of each other so fast, it looked like a glitch. And when I pulled it out, my own face stared back at me from a dozen different headlines, frozen mid-kiss, eyes wide, completely unprepared for the narrative that had already decided who I was. Unknown boyfriend of Ethan Cole revealed. Mystery man steals spotlight. Secret relationship exposed. And I actually laughed, because of course this was happening. Of course my life was spiraling because I stood in the wrong place at the wrong time and let the wrong man touch me like I mattered. And when I looked back up, Ethan was watching me, not amused, not concerned, just focused, like he was measuring my reaction, waiting to see if I would break or bend, and I hated that I did not know which one I was about to do. "This goes away if we control it," he said, voice lower now, closer, and I did not miss the way he stepped in just slightly, closing the distance like it was natural, like it was expected, like we had already agreed to something I had not signed yet. "Control it how?" I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer. And when he said, "You stay with me for 1 week," it landed heavier than the headlines, heavier than the kiss, heavier than the way my pulse jumped like it recognized the beginning of something I was not ready for. And I should have said no. I should have walked away, but instead I stood there, caught between the version of my life I knew and the version he was offering. And I realized too late that this was not about fixing a problem anymore. It was about stepping into one I might not be able to leave. I should have walked away right then, should have laughed in his face and said no like a normal person, with self-preservation instincts. But instead I heard myself ask, what exactly does 1 week mean? And Ethan did not hesitate, did not even blink, just stepped closer like the answer was already written somewhere between us. "It means you stay with me, you attend events with me, and you do not contradict the narrative." And the way he said narrative made it sound less like a lie and more like something carefully constructed, something controlled, and I hated how that word wrapped around me. Because control had never been something I associated with my life. Not with late rent notices or freelance gigs that barely covered groceries. And now suddenly, I was being offered a version of control that came with him, with his world, with the way people looked at him like he could bend outcomes just by deciding them. And after 7 days, I pressed, because that part mattered. It had to matter. "You go back to your life," he said, and something about that should have reassured me, should have made this feel temporary, manageable, safe. But instead it felt like a warning, like a line drawn in a place I had not realized I was already standing near, and I found myself watching him too closely, noticing the small things I should not have noticed, like how his shoulders relaxed just slightly when I did not immediately refuse, like how his gaze dropped for half a second to my mouth before returning to my eyes as if he was checking something, confirming something, and that tiny moment did something uncomfortable to my chest, like my body was trying to keep up with a conversation my brain had not agreed to. "There have to be rules," I said, because that felt like something I could hold on to, something solid. And he nodded once, sharp, decisive. "There are," he said. "You do not speak to the press without me. You do not contradict me in public, and you do not disappear." And that last one landed differently, heavier, like it carried more weight than the others, like it was not just about appearances, and I should have questioned it, should have pushed back. But instead I focused on the one rule that mattered most, the one I needed to hear out loud. "And this stays fake," I said, forcing the words out like they might anchor me. And for the first time since this started, Ethan paused. Not long, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. Enough to make my pulse trip over itself as something unreadable flickered across his expression before it smoothed out again. "Of course," he said, calm, certain, but the way his voice lowered just slightly made it feel less like a promise and more like something unfinished. And before I could decide whether that reassured me or unsettled me more, he reached past me, his hand brushing lightly against my sleeve as he opened the door behind me. And it was nothing, barely contact, just a fleeting touch through fabric, but my entire body reacted like it had been waiting for that exact moment, like it recognized something I did not want to name, and I stepped back too quickly, clearing my throat like that would fix whatever just happened, like that would reset the balance I was already losing. "Fine," I said, because apparently I was making terrible decisions tonight. 1 week, and Ethan's gaze sharpened, something almost satisfied settling into it as he nodded once, decisive, like a deal had just been sealed without paperwork, without witnesses, without me fully understanding what I had agreed to. And as we stepped back into the noise of the gala, cameras still flashing, people still watching, I realized too late that this was not just about pretending anymore. Because the moment his hand found the small of my back again, steady, certain, guiding me forward like I belonged there, It felt less like acting and more like stepping into something I might not be able to step out of when the week was over. The moment we stepped back into the main hall, it was like walking into a spotlight I had never asked for. Except this time I knew exactly why everyone was staring, because Ethan's hand was still at my back, steady and deliberate, not gripping, not forcing, just there, like a quiet reminder that I was part of the scene now, whether I liked it or not. And every step we took felt rehearsed even though nothing about this was planned, at least not by me, and I could feel the shift in the room. Conversations lowering, eyes tracking us, phones subtly lifting, and my brain kept repeating one very simple thought that refused to go away. This is fake, this is fake, this is fake. But my body was not getting the message. Not when his thumb brushed once along my side like he was guiding me. Not when he leaned in slightly and said, "Smile," in a voice so low only I could hear it. And I hated that I did, hated that it felt natural, like I had done this before. Like I belonged next to him instead of being the guy who usually stood near the exit calculating whether he could afford another drink. And then someone approached us, some sharply dressed man with a practiced smile and curious eyes. "Ethan, you were holding out on us," he said, glancing at me like I was a puzzle he was already trying to solve. And before I could even think about what to say, Ethan's hand shifted just slightly, not tighter, just more present, anchoring, and his tone changed, warmer but controlled. "Noah Bennett," he said, introducing me like my name carried weight, like it meant something in this room. And the way he said it did something strange to my chest, like it filled a space I did not realize was empty, and I forced myself to nod, to act like this was normal, like I was not one wrong sentence away from collapsing this entire illusion. And the conversation moved around me. Business, numbers, things I barely followed. But every now and then Ethan would glance at me, quick, subtle, like he was checking that I was still there, still playing along, and every time he did, I felt it, that small, inconvenient pull, like I was being seen. In a way I was not used to, and it was not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet awareness that stayed under my skin and refused to leave. And when the man finally walked away, I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath. "You are doing fine," Ethan said, and it was not praise, not exactly, but it was not neutral either, and I turned to him, lowering my voice. "You say that like this is a performance." And his gaze held mine for a second longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering there before he replied. "It is," but the way he said it made it sound like that was not the whole truth, like there was something else layered underneath that he was not ready to say. And before I could push further, another flash of cameras caught us, brighter this time, closer, and instinctively, without thinking, I shifted half a step toward him, and his hand followed, settling more firmly at my back like it had always been there, like it knew exactly where it belonged. And that was the moment it hit me, sharp and undeniable. This was not just about convincing everyone else. This was about convincing myself too, because the longer I stood there, the easier it became to forget where the line was supposed to be, and the more dangerous that felt, because 1 week suddenly did not feel like a limit anymore. It felt like a countdown I was not ready for. By the time we left the gala, my face hurt from smiling, and my brain felt like it had been running a marathon I never signed up for. And I kept telling myself it was over for tonight, that I could finally step away, breathe, go back to my small apartment with the flickering kitchen light and the couch that dipped in the middle. But then Ethan's car door opened, and he looked at me like the next step was obvious, like there had never been another option. "You are coming with me," he said, not a question, not even close. And I blinked at him because for a second I forgot what we agreed on. Forgot the part where 1 week meant more than just pretending in public. "I can go home," I said, because I needed to say it, needed to hear myself push back at least once. And something in his expression shifted, not anger, not frustration, just a quiet kind of certainty that made my words feel smaller than they should have. "Not tonight," he replied, and there it was again, that tone controlled, but firm. Like he was not asking me to stay, he was telling me what was already happening, and I should have argued, should have insisted, but instead I found myself hesitating, caught between the version of myself that always walked away and the one that had already stepped too far in to pretend this was nothing. And before I could decide, I was inside the car, the door closing with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, like a line being drawn behind me. and the ride was quiet. Not awkward exactly, just filled with something unspoken that sat between us. And I kept staring out the window at the city lights blurring past, trying to remind myself that this was temporary, that this was a transaction, that in 7 days I would be back to normal. Except the more I repeated it, the less it felt true, because nothing about this felt normal anymore. Not the way he sat beside me like he owned the space without trying. Not the way. My body stayed hyper-aware of him even when I refused to look directly at him. And when we finally stopped, I stepped out and looked up, really looked, and the building in front of me did not just say expensive. It said unreachable, the kind of place I would normally walk past without even considering stepping inside. And yet here I was, following him again, because apparently that was what I did now. And the elevator ride up felt longer than it should have, the silence stretching in a way that made every small movement noticeable. The shift of his hand as he pressed the button, the quiet hum of the cables, the reflection of both of us in the mirrored wall, standing just close enough to look like something real. And I hated how convincing it was. And when the doors finally opened, I expected something cold, something impersonal. But the space we stepped into was different, still immaculate, still precise, but lived in. Subtle details that made it feel less like a showroom and more like somewhere someone actually stayed. And that realization hit me harder than it should have, because this was not just his world, it was where he let people in. And now I was here, standing in the middle of it. And before I could overthink it, he turned to me, his gaze steady, unreadable, but focused in a way that made it hard to look away. "You will take the guest room," he said. And there was something almost careful in the way he said it, like he was drawing a boundary for me before I could question it. And I nodded, because that was safe, that was manageable. But as I moved past him, just barely brushing his shoulder, I felt it again, that same quiet pull, stronger this time, more present. And it made me pause for half a second longer than I should have, because the truth was starting to settle in, slow and uncomfortable. This was supposed to be fake, but everything about it was beginning to feel dangerously real. The door to the guest room clicked softly behind me, and for a second I just stood there, staring at a space that felt too clean, too quiet, too different from anything I was used to. Like even the air in here knew it belonged to a world I had never been invited into before tonight. And I told myself to breathe, to reset, to remember this was temporary, that in 7 days I would walk out of here and none of this would follow me. But the thought did not settle the way it should have. It just hovered, uncertain, like it was already losing its grip on me. And I dropped my bag on the bed, running a hand through my hair as I tried to shake off the night, the cameras, the way people looked at me like I was suddenly someone worth noticing, and most of all the way Ethan's voice kept replaying in my head, steady and controlled, like everything around him was something he could manage, including me. And that was the part that bothered me the most, not because it was wrong, but because a small, inconvenient part of me was starting to feel like it might be true, and I hated that. Hated how easily I had stepped into his world, how quickly I had adjusted to standing beside him like I belonged there. And I moved toward the window, looking out over the city lights stretching for miles, trying to ground myself in something familiar, something that did not involve him. But it did not work, because even here, even alone, I could still feel it, that subtle awareness of him somewhere, just beyond this room, like my body had already mapped out his presence and refused to ignore it. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, turning away from the window just as there was a knock at the door, soft but deliberate, and my chest tightened in a way that made no sense, because it was just him, just Ethan, nothing more, nothing less. And I opened the door before I could overthink it. And there he was, standing just outside like he had not moved since I walked in, like he had been waiting. And for a second neither of us said anything, the silence stretching in a way that felt too full for something that was supposed to be simple. "You will need this," he said finally, holding out a small stack of folded clothes, and I blinked, taking them without thinking, my fingers brushing his for the briefest second, barely contact, but enough to send. That same quiet awareness threw me again, sharper this time, harder to ignore, and I pulled back too quickly, clearing my throat like that would fix it, like that would reset whatever was shifting between us. "Thanks," I said, because it was easier than addressing the way my pulse had picked up over something so small. And he nodded once, but he did not leave, did not step away. just stayed there, watching me with that same focused gaze that made it feel like he was seeing more than I was. Showing, tomorrow starts early, he added, and I frowned slightly, because of course it did. Of course this was not just a one-time performance. It was a schedule, a plan, something structured, and I nodded again, trying to keep it simple, trying to keep it distant. Right, 1 week, I said, and this time, when he looked at me, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Like he was reacting to the words more than he should have, like they meant something different to him than they did to me, and his voice dropped just slightly when he replied, 1 week. But the way he said it did not feel like an agreement. It felt like a reminder, like something he was already measuring in a way I did not understand yet. And then, finally, he stepped back, giving me space, giving me distance, but not before his gaze lingered for just a second longer than necessary, like he was committing something to memory. And when the door closed again, I leaned back against it, pressing my hand flat against the wood as I tried to steady myself, because the truth was becoming harder to ignore with every passing moment. This was supposed to be simple, controlled, temporary, but the longer I stayed here, the more it felt like I had already crossed into something I might not be able to walk away from when the time came. I woke up before my alarm, which was already suspicious because I never wake up before my alarm, and for a few seconds I just lay there staring at a ceiling that was not mine, in a room that still felt too quiet, too controlled, too different, and then it hit me all over again. The gala, the kiss, the deal, Ethan, and my stomach did that uncomfortable drop like it was trying to catch up with a reality I had agreed to too quickly, and I pushed myself up, running a hand over my face as I tried to reset, telling myself this was day one, just day one, manageable, temporary, but the words felt thinner this morning, like they had lost some of their weight overnight, and I got dressed in the clothes he gave me, which fit better than they should have, like someone had already anticipated my size, and that thought alone made me pause for a second longer than I liked, because it felt too intentional, too prepared, and I stepped out into the hallway, just as the scent of coffee drifted through the space, subtle but grounding, and my feet carried me toward the kitchen before I could second-guess it. And there he was, already awake, already composed, standing by the counter like he had been there for hours instead of minutes. And the sight of him like this, without the crowd, without the noise, felt different in a way I was not ready to process, quieter, more real. And for a second I just stood there, watching him, because it was easier than stepping fully into whatever this was becoming. You are early, he said without turning, like he already knew I was there. And that small detail sent a strange awareness through me again, like I had been noticed before I even spoke, and I cleared my throat, stepping further in. You said it starts early, I replied, trying to keep my tone even, trying to keep this simple, and he nodded slightly, finally turning toward me, and his gaze lingered for a fraction of a second, just enough to make my pulse shift, like he was taking in something he had not seen before, even though we had been standing inches apart all night. And I looked away first, because of course I did. Focusing on the cup of coffee, he slid toward me like this was routine, like this was normal, and I took it, our fingers brushing again, brief, almost nothing, but enough to remind me how aware I had become of every small point of contact. And I hated that, hated how my body kept reacting to things I could easily ignore any other day. We have a meeting at 9, he said, moving through the space with that same controlled ease. And I blinked, because I had not thought that far ahead, had not considered that this was not just about appearances, it was about integration, about stepping into his life in a way that blurred the lines even further. What kind of meeting? I asked, and he paused just slightly, glancing at me in a way that felt almost deliberate before answering. One where you stand next to me. And something about that answer settled heavier than it should have, because it was simple, but not really. Because standing next to him was already becoming something more than a position. It was becoming a role I was slipping into too easily, and I took a sip of the coffee just to give myself something to do, something to anchor me, but it did not help, not when he stepped closer, not touching, just close enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. Stay close, he added, voice lower now, and my breath caught slightly before I could stop it, because those two words should not have meant anything. They should have been part of the act, part of the agreement, but the way he said them felt different, like it was not just about today, not just about the meeting, and I nodded anyway, because that was easier than unpacking whatever that tone did to me. And as we stood there, closer than necessary, coffee in hand, morning light cutting through the windows, I realized something I did not want to admit yet. The line between pretending and something else was already starting to blur, and I was not sure I was trying very hard to keep it in place anymore. The car ride to the meeting was quieter than it should have been, not uncomfortable exactly, but filled with something that felt like it was waiting to be acknowledged. And I kept my eyes on the city passing by, glass buildings catching the morning light, people moving through their routines like nothing had changed, like my life had not been flipped in less than 24 hours. And beside me Ethan sat like he always did, composed, unreadable, like this was just another day, another step in something he had already planned out long before I was pulled into it. And I told myself to stay focused, to remember the rules, to keep this simple. But the closer we got, the more I could feel that quiet tension building again. Not panic, not exactly, just awareness, the kind that settled under your skin and refused to leave. And when the car stopped and the door opened, I hesitated for half a second before stepping out, because the building in front of us was even more intimidating up close. All glass and steel and quiet authority. The kind of place where people knew exactly what they were doing, and I was very aware that I did not. And before I could overthink it, Ethan's hand found the small of my back again, light but steady, guiding me forward like it was the most natural thing in the world. And my body reacted before my brain could catch up, that same subtle shift in my pulse, that same awareness that I was starting to recognize too well. And I told myself it was part of the act, just part of the act. Except it did not feel like acting anymore. Not when we walked into the lobby and every pair of eyes seemed to follow us. Not when people greeted him with respect that bordered on something else, something sharper, something heavier. And then they looked at me, not dismissive, not confused, but curious, like I mattered simply because I was next to him. And that realization sat strangely in my chest, because I had never been looked at like that before, and I was not sure if I liked it or if I was already getting used to it. And the elevator ride up was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, closer, and I could see our reflection in the mirrored wall, standing side by side. His posture relaxed, controlled, mine just a fraction tighter, like I was still catching up, and for a second I wondered how convincing we looked, how real this seemed from the outside, and whether I was the only one who could still see the line we were supposed to be pretending to stay behind. And when the doors opened, everything shifted again, people moving quickly, voices low but efficient, and Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, and I followed, because that was what I did now. And the meeting room was already full when we entered, conversations pausing just slightly, attention shifting, and I felt it again, that weight of expectation, like I had stepped into a role I had not auditioned for. And Ethan did not slow down, did not break stride, just took his place at the head of the table like it belonged to him. And then, without looking at me, without needing to, he reached back just slightly, fingers brushing against my wrist for the briefest second, a quiet signal, a reminder. And I moved closer, standing beside him like he had instructed, like I was part of this, like I had always been part of this. And the meeting started, voices blending into discussions I only half followed, but I could feel his presence next to me, steady, grounding, and every so often his hand would shift, barely noticeable, brushing against mine, adjusting his position just enough that the space between us never quite disappeared. And I told myself it was deliberate, controlled, part of maintaining the image. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore. The way it affected me, the way my attention kept drifting back to those small moments, those almost touches that felt like more than they should have. And when someone across the table made a comment that drew a quiet laugh from the room, I felt his hand settle more firmly at my side for a second longer than necessary. And it was nothing, just a gesture, just part of the act, but it grounded me in a way I was not ready to admit. And as the meeting continued, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. I was not just playing along anymore. I was adapting, adjusting, fitting into this space beside him in a way that felt increasingly natural. And the more natural it felt, the more dangerous it became, because I could already feel the edges of that 1 week starting to blur, and I was not sure I wanted them to come back into focus. It was not the meeting that unsettled me. It was what came after, because the moment we stepped out of that room, The noise dropped away and the space between us shifted again, like something unspoken had followed us out and was now waiting to be acknowledged, and I exhaled slowly, rolling my shoulders like I could shake off the tension that had built up over the past hour. But it did not go anywhere. It just settled deeper, quieter, more persistent, and before I could step away, before I could create even a little distance, Ethan's voice cut in, low and steady. "You did well." And I blinked because I was not expecting that. Not from him. Not like that. And I let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh. "I just stood there," I replied, but his gaze held mine. Sharp, certain, like he was not talking about the meeting anymore, like he was talking about something else entirely. "Exactly," he said. And the way he said it made my chest tighten in a way that felt too close to something I was not ready to name. And I looked away first, because that was becoming a pattern I did not like, focusing instead on the hallway, the movement of people passing by, anything that was not him, and for a second I thought we were done, that we would just leave, go back, reset. But then someone approached, a woman this time, confident, composed, the kind of presence that did not need to ask for attention because it already had it, and her eyes moved from Ethan to me in one smooth, assessing glance that made me instantly aware of where I stood. "So you are the reason my inbox has not stopped exploding," she said lightly. But there was something underneath it, something sharper, and I opened my mouth to respond, to say something neutral, something safe. But before I could, Ethan stepped slightly closer, not blocking me, not interrupting, just closing the space in a way that felt deliberate. And his hand brushed against my back again, not possessive, not overt, just present. Like a quiet claim that did not need to be announced because it was already understood. "Noah," he said, introducing me again. But this time his voice carried something different, something steadier, something that felt less like a performance and more like a statement. And the woman's gaze flickered, just slightly, like she caught it too, like she understood something I was still trying to figure out. And the conversation moved on, polite, controlled, but I could feel it, that subtle shift in the air. That awareness that this was no longer just about appearances. And when she finally walked away, I turned to him, lowering my voice. "You did not have to do that," because I needed to say it, needed to remind both of us what this was supposed to be. And he looked at me, really looked this time, like he was weighing something, considering something. And for a moment, I thought he might say something that would reset this, something that would bring it back to the agreement, the rules, the distance we were supposed to maintain. But instead he said, "I know." And that was it. Simple, quiet. And somehow that made everything more complicated, because it meant he was choosing this. Choosing the way he stood closer, the way his hand lingered just a second longer than necessary, the way his attention stayed fixed on me even when there were 100 other things demanding it. And I felt it again, that pull, stronger now, harder to ignore, like I was being drawn into something that was no longer just about playing along. And I told myself to step back, to create space, to remember that this had an end, that this was temporary. But my feet did not move, my body did not listen. And when he said, "We are leaving," his voice lower, closer, like it was meant only for me, I nodded without thinking, falling in a step beside him like it was already instinct, like I had already adjusted to this position next to him in a way that felt too natural, too easy. And as we walked through the building, past people who watched us with that same curious attention, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else so far. This was not just him controlling the situation anymore. This was me letting it happen, and that might be the most dangerous part of all. The ride back felt different, and I knew. At the moment the car door closed and the city noise faded into something distant, because this time I did not look out the window right away, I looked at him, and that alone felt like a mistake. Because Ethan was already watching me, not casually, not briefly, but like he had been waiting for me to do exactly that. And the second our eyes met, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air between us tightened just slightly. And I looked away first, again, because I was starting to realize that was becoming a habit I could not seem to break. And I hated that. Hated how easily he pulled that reaction out of me without even trying. And the silence stretched, not empty, not awkward, just full, like it was carrying everything neither of us was saying. And I could feel it building, that quiet pressure under my skin, that awareness that had been following me since last night, growing with every glance, every almost touch, every moment that felt a little too real for something that was supposed to be fake, and I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice to stay steady. This ends in 6 days, because I needed to say it out loud, needed to anchor it in something solid before it slipped any further out of reach. And for a second he did not respond, just looked at me like he was considering the words, weighing them. And then he nodded once, calm, controlled. Yes, he said. But the way he said it did not feel like agreement. It felt like acknowledgement, like he was accepting the timeline without necessarily accepting what it meant. And that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because it meant I was the only one holding on to the idea that this had a clear end. And I turned slightly, facing forward again, because that was easier than trying to read whatever was behind his expression. And the rest of the ride passed in that same quiet tension, neither of us speaking, neither of us fully pulling away. And when we arrived back at the apartment, I stepped out first, needing the movement, needing the space, but it did not help, because he was right behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence without looking, and the elevator ride up felt longer than it should have, the silence heavier now, more deliberate, and I could see our reflection again in the mirrored wall, standing side by side like something real, like something established, and that image unsettled me more than anything else, because it looked convincing, too convincing. And when the doors opened, I stepped out quickly, moving toward the hallway, toward my room, because I needed distance, needed to remind myself where the lines were. And I was almost there, almost past him, when his voice stopped me. Low, closer than I expected. Noah. And I froze, because the way he said my name did something I could not ignore, something that pulled at me in a way that was becoming harder to resist. And I turned slowly, meeting his gaze, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us charged with something I did not have a name for yet. And then he stepped closer, not invading, not overwhelming, just closing the gap enough that I could feel it again, that same steady presence, that same quiet intensity that made it hard to think clearly. Do not pull away from me in public, he said, and the words were simple, part of the agreement, part of the role, but the way he said them felt different, like they carried something more than just instruction, something that reached past the surface and settled somewhere deeper, and I swallowed, forcing myself to respond. That is the deal. Because that was safe, that was controlled. But he did not step back, did not create distance, just held my gaze for a second longer, like he was searching for something, confirming something. And then, finally, he nodded, stepping away just enough to break the moment, and I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath, turning quickly toward my room before I could overthink it, before I could let whatever that was settle any further. And as the door closed behind me, I leaned against it again, pressing my hand flat against the wood like I had the night before, but this time it felt different, heavier, because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore now. This was not just him pulling me into his world anymore. This was me standing in it, staying in it, and the more I tried to remind myself that it would end, the less certain that felt, because something had already shifted, something that did not care about timelines or agreements, something that made the idea of leaving feel less like a relief and more like something I might not be ready to face. I did not sleep well, and that alone should have been a warning, because my brain would not stop replaying every small moment, every glance, every shift in his voice like it was trying to piece together something I was not ready to understand yet. And by the time morning came, I felt like I had already lived through an entire day before even stepping out of the room, and I told myself to reset, to keep things simple, to remember the rules. But the moment I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, I knew that was not going to happen, because Ethan was already there, leaning slightly against the wall like he had been waiting, like this was intentional, and the sight of him there, already composed, already focused, did something to my chest that I immediately tried to ignore. "You are awake early again," he said, and there was something softer in his tone this time, something less controlled, and I forced myself to nod, stepping past him toward the kitchen because distance felt necessary, distance felt safe, but it did not last long, not when he followed, not when his presence filled the space behind me in a way that made it impossible to forget he was there, and I reached for a glass just to have something to do, something to anchor myself, but my hand stilled halfway when he spoke again, closer now. "You keep pulling away." And the words were quiet, not accusing, not sharp, just observant. And that somehow made them land harder, because it meant he noticed, it meant he was paying attention in a way that went beyond the agreement. And I let out a small breath, turning slightly. We agreed this is not real, I said, because I needed to say it, needed to hold on to that line before it disappeared completely. And for a second he did not respond, just watched me with that same unreadable expression. But there was something underneath it now, something I could not quite place, something that made it harder to look away. That does not mean it is nothing, he replied, and the words settled into the space between us, heavier than they should have been, because they did not fit into the structure we had set. They did not belong in something that was supposed to be controlled, temporary, defined, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, because that was the first time he had said something that did not align with the rules, and I did not know how to respond to that, did not know how to push back against something that felt too close to the truth I was trying to avoid, and I looked away. Again, because that was easier, focusing on the glass in my hand, the way the light hit the surface, anything that was not him. But then he stepped closer, not touching, just closing the distance enough that I could feel it, that shift in the air that had become too familiar too quickly, and my breath caught slightly before I could stop it, because my body was reacting again, betraying me in ways I was starting to recognize, but not control. Noah, he said, and this time my name sounded different, lower, more certain, like it carried weight I had not given it before, and I looked up despite myself, meeting his gaze, and for a moment everything else faded, the room, the noise, the distance I had been trying to create, and it was just him, just the way he was looking at me like he had already made a decision I had not caught up to yet. And then he said it, simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Do not act like you do not feel it. And my breath hitched slightly, because that was it. That was the thing I had been avoiding, the thing I had been pushing down since the moment he kissed me, and I should have denied it, should have laughed it off, should have stepped back and reminded him of the rules, but I did not, because for the first time since this started, I was not sure I could pretend that part did not exist anymore, and the silence stretched between us, heavier now, more real, and I realized something that settled deeper than anything else so far. This was no longer just about maintaining a story for everyone else. This was about facing the fact that somewhere along the way, the line between fake and real had not just blurred, it had started to disappear entirely. I should have said something, should have denied it, should have stepped back and reminded both of us what this was supposed to be. But the words did not come, they just stayed somewhere behind my ribs, caught between what I wanted to say and what I knew was already true. And the silence stretched just long enough to say everything for me. And Ethan did not move, did not rush, just watched me like he was waiting, not for an answer, but for me to stop pretending I did not have one. And that realization hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant he already knew, already saw through every excuse I had been holding on to. And I exhaled slowly, my grip tightening slightly around the glass in my hand before I set it down, because I needed both hands free, needed to ground myself in something real. This still ends, I said finally, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. But it was enough to remind myself there was a line, that there had to be a line, and for a moment his expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, something quieter, deeper, like he was acknowledging the words without agreeing to what they meant. In 6 days, he repeated, and the way he said it felt different, not like a deadline, but like something he was measuring, something he was already planning around, and my chest tightened slightly, because that tone did not sound like someone preparing to let go. It sounded like someone deciding what to do next, and I took a small step back, needing the space, needing to breathe, but he moved forward at the same time, not closing the distance completely, just enough to keep it from widening, and that small adjustment said more than anything else he could have done, because it was not accidental, it was deliberate, controlled, and I felt it again, that pull, stronger now, impossible to ignore, like something had settled into place between us without either of us saying it out loud, and I forced myself to meet his gaze, because looking away was not working anymore, pretending was not working anymore. You said this was to fix a problem, I added, because I needed to understand, needed to find something that still made sense in all of this. And for the first time since this started, he hesitated, just slightly, just enough to make me realize that whatever answer he had now was not the same one he started with. And that should have been reassuring, should have meant something was changing in a way I could control, but it did not. It just made everything feel more uncertain, more real. It was, he said, and his voice was still calm, still steady, but there was something underneath it now, something that had not been there before, something that made the words feel incomplete, and I frowned slightly, because that was not enough, not anymore, and I could feel it, that shift inside me, that quiet realization that I was not just reacting to him anymore. I was starting to question him, to push back in a way I had not before, and that should have created distance, should have drawn a line between us. But instead it seemed to do the opposite, because his gaze sharpened slightly, like he was focusing in, like he was paying even more attention now, and the space between us felt smaller without either of us moving. And now, I started, but the words faltered, because I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer, not if it confirmed what I was already starting to feel, and he did not let me finish, did not interrupt, just stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the shift in the air, close enough that everything else faded just slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more certain than it had been all morning. Now it is something else, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because that was it. That was the moment everything settled into place, not cleanly, not safely, but clearly, and I should have stepped back, should have created distance, should have reminded him and myself that this had an end, that it had to end, but I did not move, did not pull away, because the truth was already there, already undeniable, and for the first time since this started, I realized something that changed everything. I was not just waiting for the week to be over anymore. I was starting to wonder what would happen if it was not.